listen, everybody, thank you for coming and attending this. We're kind of excited to walk through this program. We've entitled this The Weakest Link, identifying and reacting to financially distressed companies before they fail. Now, this is part one. We will be doing a part two. We ran through this and decided there's really two separate pieces of this, so we'll divide this into two pieces. The first one we'll walk through really the details. We've all seen cases where there could be a bankruptcy, a chapter filing of some kind, could be a receivership, an assignment for the benefit of creditors, and we're caught off guard. We see that, we're like, when did this happen? And today we're going to try and dig into some of those details where we can see this stuff coming earlier and be prepared. And I want to thank Lowenstein Sandler. We brought in some professionals to assist with this. It's history and experience. I'm really excited. It was nice work with you guys setting this up. I really appreciate doing this with Lowenstein as well. Great knowledge. But let's get started. So we'll cover a couple of areas here. We'll begin with the warning signs of future company bankruptcy, things to be looking for throughout this process, and then also get into the sources of information to see these variables coming up so we're not caught off guard. And I love the freight train. If you look at that, it appears like it's moving. So really, we're looking for the warning signs of future company bankruptcy. A financially distressed borrower company should really come as no surprise. The train is a good one. You hear the whistle of the train, you hear this thing coming, the ground is shaking. And a lot of times we see these bankruptcies or these wind downs coming, they're easy, but there's a lot of things going on that we're missing. So we're trying to identify these liquidation warning signs, but also take steps to mitigate the risk as they're coming. There's also an important caveat there underneath the picture. Fraud cases may come with little or no warning, and that's true. We'll talk about that and some examples in part two of the presentation on another day.
So, as Patrick set the table, we and when I say we, I'm referring both to us, Lowenstein, as bankruptcy professionals, as well as Patrick and the folks at Cadex. We like to look ahead. We like to look down the road because we don't want to get hit by the freight train Patrick just told you about. And we start sort of from 30,000 feet, and then we zoom in all the way down to the individual company level. But we start more broadly, and we tend to start with macroeconomic risk factors. What's going on in the world surrounding the companies we're concerned about, surrounding the industries we're concerned about, and surrounding sort of the economy as a whole. So we look at things in the first instance, like changes in overall demand, right? What's going on with the economy writ large? Is there a recession in any particular country? Is there a threat of a recession in any particular country where our customers, our borrowers, and others are focused? Unanticipated shocks are somewhat of a tough one because you can't necessarily see them coming. I think the recent U.S.-Iran war is probably the biggest example of that. I think there were folks that had speculated and pontificated that something might happen. But I think as a whole, business people generally didn't really see that coming. And the impact of that on oil prices, the impact of that, both during and after, and then during again, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the roller coaster that sent oil on. Those are things you can't necessarily predict, but what you can look at is what is the geopolitical climate? What is the atmosphere, surrounding, for instance, the Middle East? What is the atmosphere surrounding the domestic economy? Monetary policy, interest rates obviously, directly impact borrowing costs. If you're dealing with a borrower that has variable rate debt or has debt that they took on during the COVID pandemic when rates were lower than they really probably have ever been in any of our lifetimes. What's going to happen to those when rates reset or when refinancings happen? But interest rates also potentially impact customer demand and consumer demand. The U.S. in particular has a very consumer-driven economy. Consumer demand, essentially filters upstream all the way through the value chain, through manufacturers to raw material suppliers to everybody else in between. And And so if you see borrowing costs go up for consumers, right? If it costs more to buy a house, well, people are going to have less money to spend on other things. If it costs more to buy a car, people might buy fewer cars and they might buy new cars less frequently. They may defer other purchases of, whether it's of consumer discretionary items or whether it's durable goods. Exchange rates, and as we'll talk about in a little bit, tariffs can impact, not just individual companies, but entire industries. Sometimes entire countries, right? You can see a tariff followed by a retaliatory tariff, severely diminished trade in both directions between two trading partner countries. What does the regulatory climate look like? This one has been huge in a couple of industries that we'll talk about. In the U.S. in particular, as we've been whipsawed from a lax regulatory environment to a tightening regulatory environment back to a lax regulatory environment, especially in the environmental sphere. That has an impact not just on any particular company, but again on industries as a whole and on national economies as a whole. And energy policy and prices, obviously, that has been brought front and center in recent months with the price of oil skyrocketing shortly after the U.S. invaded Iran. And then sort of settling back down, and then traders being basically all over the map on where oil prices end up going. Still staying at the macro level, still staying zoomed out to about 30,000 feet. Interest rates we talked about. Tariffs in particular have come back into focus from the 2024 election onward. They were a principal part of President Trump's campaign platform. They became a central part of his economic and I guess more broad foreign policy from the outset of the current administration. And so what we saw in early 2025 was a pretty significant roller coaster of tariffs on imported goods, followed by retaliatory tariffs by certain countries, followed by more tariffs from our side. The interesting thing about that particular roller coaster is we saw that happen for the first 6 or 7 months of 2025, and we saw it start to calm down, in large part because a lot of companies that relied on imports saw the writing on the wall in November of 2024 and stocked up on inventory, brought in pre-tariff inventory to stock up. Well, once those stocks were depleted, we started to see the impacts of tariff policy, which had settled down a fair bit by the middle to the end of the year, but we started to see the impacts of that policy come home to roost in late 25. Zombie companies are another fascinating trend. Companies that generate enough cash to pay the cash portion of their interest, typically have paid in kind debt that where they're not required to pay cash interest. But an enormous number of companies in the U.S., the largest number, according to a couple of sources, particularly Bloomberg, that looks at this a fair bit, that are just sort of soaking up capital in the economy and preventing it from being redeployed more economically elsewhere. Those companies got a lifeline during COVID when we saw $6 trillion of new money poured into the U.S. banking system. So it had less of an impact from an overall capital allocation standpoint than it probably should have. But we're now, seeing those companies get to the point that they're facing a reckoning and having to refinance debt or extend debt, and they can't do it. To that point, the upcoming, and I guess it's not really upcoming as it has arrived this year, debt maturity wall, right? You saw in we'll call it late 2020 through about 2022, a number of companies that should not have been able to refinance, and refinance at historically low rates. We saw companies rated CCC and below in 2021 borrowing at an average rate of about 6.1%. These are companies that 6 months earlier, to a year earlier, would have been borrowing at rates in the teens if they could borrow at all. Well, those debt maturities come due in 2026, 2027, 2028. We're starting to see those companies hit the wall, come to the realization that they probably can't refinance, and their only real option is to go into bankruptcy, sell their assets, and shut down. Zooming in a little bit further now, from the macro, from the broad macro down to the industry level. We've seen a number of industries face headwinds as a result of really all of the factors I just talked about. The combination of interest rates, tariffs, monetary policy, all of those things have sort of converged on a number of industries. Manufacturing was the busiest sector in large Chapter 11 filings in 2025. An interesting trend we saw there is a number of those companies filed to reorganize and not to liquidate. But every single one of them, as part of their, their initial filings in bankruptcy, said, hey, tariffs were one of the things that drove us here. Interest rates were one of the things that drove us here. Yeah, we're over levered. Yeah, we have, operational business problems. But we're here because of these external macro factors putting pressure on us. Transportation, again.
Actually, let me jump in on
Yeah, please do.
manufacturing. There's a couple of key things here. I think the manufacturers are facing this massive disruption in supply chain. It's something they really can't avoid. You're talking about increased cost of raw materials. Some of the hidden ones are labor shortages. It's something that they're facing, but there's also this underlying AI transformation that's really causing manufacturing to have some additional headwinds.
Yeah,
I'll
and
keep going. I'll jump.
secondary.
Go ahead. I was going to jump
Yeah,
into
go ahead.
transportation real quick, and then I'll let you go after.
Yeah, please do.
Transportation's pretty obvious. You look at this. You're talking about fuel price volatility, right? This is something that they face every day. There's problems with the ports, getting in and out of certain ports worldwide, and it really puts some pressure on them. Transportation is having trouble finding drivers, right? That is a massive headwinds, but there's also this push towards green or electric, and I know that's putting some pressure on that industry as well. Go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, and commercial real estate, we obviously saw the massive shift to work from home in 2020 through, call it, most of 2022. We have seen a number of industries, banking in particular, return to the office. Some companies with a mandatory 5-day return to office, but that has not been, a broadly adopted philosophy. A number of businesses are doing a hybrid model. A number of businesses have moved certain segments of their business to pure work from home or work remotely arrangements. And so you're seeing commercial real estate get hit particularly hard, especially in certain large cities. We saw, in 2022 and 3, you saw a number of high profile, very large office developments basically just turn the keys over to the lenders. In cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, we saw a little bit less of that in New York City. There certainly has been some. There certainly have been a number of, of high-profile vacancies and otherwise in New York City. But throughout the country, commercial real estate is under a lot of pressure, and there are a lot of properties that are, sort of in a state of limbo of what's going to happen next to them. Healthcare is dependent heavily upon human capital. Human capital, as Patrick noted, in conjunction with manufacturing and transportation, has been a significant issue. We saw a record number of people leave the workforce in 2020 and 2021 that have not returned to the workforce, folks that have either retired or moved into other areas. The other major issue facing healthcare has been the combination of the Affordable Care Act and the availability of cheap money, in the past 5 or 6 years, led to an enormous swath of consolidation that has in turn resulted in an enormous spout of deconsolidation. We've seen a number of high-profile hospital systems and nursing home operators in particular, roll-ups that took on a lot of debt to roll up a lot of facilities and then, split them apart, borrowed heavily against the real estate, borrowed heavily against the operations, that have imploded in fairly spectacular and very public fashion. Retail, again, the U.S. is a pretty heavily consumer-driven economy, and we have seen retailers, as consumers are forced to make the choice between making their house payment, making their rent payment, making their car payment, or doing things like going out to eat or making discretionary purchases, really start to scale back on certain things that previously would have been, a little bit more of a freewheeling discretionary expenditure. Restaurants and hospitality. Patrick, I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on this one, but.
No, I can jump in on that too. The retail piece too. There's just imagine this retail stock delays, right? Change in consumer demand. We're all consumers. We want our product, we want it personalized. We want it now, right? That's a big change from retail. Restaurants and hospitality, the biggest thing they're running into is labor shortages. They really can't find people to do this. Food costs rising. They've got inflationary issues they're dealing with that are really insurmountable. Another piece you're talking about consumer finance. Now you touched on it earlier, but it's slowing down people in this industry. Major headwinds for them.
Yeah, and so the overarching driver of a lot of the consumer demand issues we're seeing is the deterioration of the consumer balance sheet. You're seeing consumers, depending on which measure you read, carrying aggregate credit card balances of $1.5 to $1.7 trillion, depending on which statistic you look at, which source you look at. But the reason that's particularly important is usually you see some seasonality in consumer credit card debt. You see it, go up around the end of the year as people make holiday purchases. You see it go up in the summer as people make travel purchases. But you see that number come down. You see that sort of scale up and down seasonally as people make purchases and pay them off. What we've seen over the last several quarters is that number has been sticky. It just keeps going up. As consumers take the price of the inflation that we saw between really 2021 and 2024, continuing thankfully at a slightly lesser pace in the present, although gas prices are potentially a wrinkle in that. But you see consumers putting the cost of inflation on the credit card and for the moment keeping it there, and not really having a solution to what to do with it. One of the perhaps negative upshots of that is we are seeing increases over the last few quarters in delinquencies, and you typically see this in a staggered fashion. You see credit card delinquencies start to rise. You see student loan delinquencies start to rise. We've been starting to see over the last couple of quarters mortgage delinquencies and auto delinquencies start to rise. Not at 2008 levels, not at 2009 levels, but you're seeing them tick up and kind of stay there, which is an advanced warning sign for what's really going on in the consumer economy. Now we'll zoom in a step further, right, from the macro impact on industries broadly to specific industries. And when we're looking at specific industries, you look at sort of both sides of the micro equation, right? You look at demand and you look at supply, and you look at them in tandem. Do you have an industry where you've got excess supply and you've got declining demand? Commercial real estate is a great example of that. There's a significant oversupply, and it varies by market, but there's a significant oversupply in the company as a whole, or the country as a whole, of commercial office space in the face of a declining demand. That's a secular problem for that industry, and you can take that same sort of approach to other industries as well. Shifts in consumer needs, right? What are people looking for? What are customers looking for? Are businesses looking for the types of products a particular industry produces, or is there a shift away? And competition from imports is obviously a significant issue. There's been a lot of talk of whether the current U.S. trade policy will help shift demand back to U.S. industries, but the reality is, over the last 30 years, we've seen such a contraction of U.S. manufacturing capacity in most industries that you can't just boot up factories overnight and suddenly have them start producing to fight competition from imports.
The consolidation amongst these competitors is really it's prevalent right now. We see a lot of consolidation in tech and financial services. We see it in software companies. There's a lot of industries that got a high entry point to get in, right? High barriers to enter the market, and that's where we see those consolidations take place. And also a lot of startups, and it makes sense for them. It's a great way to dive into these industries, is to get really sort of this group of competitors together to create a larger entity. But the one that caught my attention here is business failures amongst competitors, right? As a business person, your eyebrows go up and you say opportunity, right? The competitors are failing, what's going on here? But it's really something to look at as you're looking to grant credit or analyze the borrowers. Now is an opportunity, but we're looking at changes maybe in the market. Maybe some of these competitors are not adapting to some of those changes. They're behind, and it's easy. You can say poor management, things like that. Maybe a customer demand, but it's a huge area. It's something we need to keep an eye on as a warning sign that as these industries start to have some failures amongst these competitors, oftentimes there's a bigger play at hand here.
Yeah, and I guess that that can ultimately be a harbinger of doom for a particular industry, or it can be an opportunity, right? If you have a borrower that is the disruptor in an industry, and that's why their competitors are failing, that could be a good thing for your borrower. But if you've got a borrower that's in an industry where there have been multiple failures because the industry is dying, that's a pretty significant warning sign. Now we're going to zoom in from the industry level down to the borrower itself, down to the individual company. We talked about debt maturities. If you have a borrower that has a significant maturity that comes due, let's say in late 2027. Well, under US GAAP, that's going to become a current liability 12 months before it becomes due. So they should be looking at refinancing that debt maturity now. And one of the things to consider is, are they going to be able to refinance that, whether it's with you, whether that's with another lender? If they're in a position where they've got COVID era debt that's covenant light, that has a currently way below market interest rate, and they're a company that's troubled for other reasons from the rest of this list and the next one, um, you know, consider whether they're going to be able to refinance that debt, or whether they're going to come into a position where they say, look, my only option is to file Chapter 11. Companies with declining liquidity. I know, Patrick, you have some thoughts on this one.
Yeah, well, whenever we see this, they traditionally are having problems turning their assets into cash, general over leveraging, right? And there's a lot of reals. It's going to be a sales decline, hitting some short term obligations, um, payroll expenses. But every time we see that, it's an area of concern.
Yeah, and companies, just from our perspective, companies go bankrupt for two reasons, right? They run out of cash, or they've got too much debt. Usually those things go hand in hand, and so that
Or
ties into
both.
excessive, or both. And that ties into excessive leverage. We see companies now that go into bankruptcy that have just eye-watering amounts of debt that cannot be supported by their operations. The most recent example, QVC filed bankruptcy a few weeks ago. QVC went into bankruptcy with nearly $7 billion in funded debt. And they went in with a plan to equitize over $5 billion of that. What does that tell you? Well, they may have been a wee bit over levered coming into bankruptcy. Paid in kind debt. Paid in kind debt, was increasing in popularity pre-COVID. It skyrocketed in popularity during COVID. Paid in kind debt, as we all probably know, is debt where the interest is paid not in cash, but either mandatorily or at the election of the borrower with more principal, which in turn accrues more debt, which is paid with more principal. That sort of double compounding effect has the effect of not only avoiding the potential canary in the coal mine of an interest payment default if the company had to pay cash interest, but it also has the effect of ramping up the leverage at a really rapid pace. And frequently we see companies that have a lot of PIK debt, that have operational problems, they have declining sales, declining EBITDA. Meanwhile, they've got this debt stack that's just growing and growing and growing. And you see, you run a simple ratio analysis on them and say, holy cow, this company is levered 14 times EBITDA. Not a sustainable operational and capital structure situation. Covenant breaches. Covenant breaches are important. And I know, Patrick, I think you have some thoughts on this as well.
Well, I do. There's two areas. You've got these financial covenant breaches, and you can get your eyes on those fairly easily. But it's the non-financial breaches, especially for secured lenders. A lot of these may include operational issues, right? Problems with insurance, right? Not covered insurance, or business practices, those kinds of breaches. It's hard to get your arms around those, but once you see that, you notice some big changes. There are debt to equity ratios, right? Even some cash flow breaches, but they're huge. They can cover a lot of different financial and non-financial breaches.
And that's another situation where, before, we'll call it the 2 or 3 years before COVID, where we saw covenant light debt really coming to the forefront. During COVID, a lot of the refinancings that we saw and a lot of the amendments that we saw in secured debt facilities and in secured credit facilities tended to involve debt that was like covenant light, or almost in some cases covenant zero, right? You open the Bloomberg terminal and click through to the covenants tab, and it's no, 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 right? No, every possible financial and operational covenant is missing. So there are a lot of facilities out there, unfortunately, particularly among troubled companies, that are missing that canary in the coal mine now. But where you do have, covenants other than like, hey, we missed an interest payment, seeing a breach can be an advance warning sign that trouble is afoot. If you see a borrower enter into a forbearance agreement with other tranches of debt, other lenders, other bondholders, or they come to you about a forbearance agreement, hey, we anticipate a covenant default next quarter, we'd like to talk to you about a forbearance. If you're in a junior secured position or you're in a subordinated position, and your borrower is negotiating with somebody senior to you over a forbearance, or you hear a forbearance announced, typically they're not doing that so they can find more money to pay you. They're doing that to talk about, how to proceed toward, a restructuring or a bankruptcy or something of that nature. Aggressive private lenders with loan to own ambitions. So you've got a fund that's the lender as opposed to a traditional bank lender. They're somewhere in the capital structure, and their goal is to basically, I don't want to use the word predatorily, but they want to opportunistically prey upon a default, right? They buy into the debt usually in the secondary market, or they lend into a distressed company with the intention of taking the company when it goes into bankruptcy. Liability management transactions, a transaction where a distressed company goes out to its existing capital structure and says, hey, we need some more cash. And as part of that, that arrangement, folks, in a broadly syndicated loan or a broadly traded bond offering, you'll see certain parties participate in an LME and end up at the very, very head of the capital stack, usually relying on, weaknesses and openings in documents and in intercreditor agreements to the extent you're in, some other piece of their capital structure, to reshuffle the priorities of their existing debt and put the participating lenders in a better position. Those frequently result in litigation, and that litigation, unfortunately, all too frequently results in bankruptcy. I actually heard a statistic recently from a Harvard professor that 70% of the companies that have gone through liability management transactions have still ended up in bankruptcy between 12 and 18 months later. Operational warning signs. So now we're still looking at the borrower itself. We're zoomed in all the way to the borrower level. Now we've moved from their balance sheet to their operations, right? How are they doing in their actual business that supports the capital structure on the balance sheet we talked about on the last slide? Sales declines, top line problems, gross margin problems. Unfortunately for a lot of companies, we've seen these in tandem, right? You see demand shocks, or you see, secular demand declines at particular companies and industries, coupled with an increase in operating costs, whether it's as a result of increased energy prices, whether it's as a result of tariffs. You see margin pressure coming at them from both sides as their cost of goods sold goes up and their actual revenues go down. Unfortunately, in tandem with that, we frequently see increases in operating expenses. Again, energy costs, costs of human capital, costs of real estate. We saw the cost of basically everything go up, over a 3 or 4 year period, pretty drastically. Companies are scrambling to find a way to fill that gap, and it can't just be raising their prices if they lack the market power to do so. Company with weaker negative operating cash flow. Again, this ties back to the zombie company concept and the macro factors. If you've got a company that is generating just a little bit of cash from operations, or is not generating any, or is losing cash from operations, sometimes, frequently, I would say, at least in the companies we look at, you'll see companies in that position sell off capital assets, sell off lines of business, sell off, particular, facilities. A lot of times you may see a sale and leaseback transaction where they sell off real estate that they own, which provides them some financial stability in order to get, a bundle of cash in the door to fund their operating cash losses. Well, at some point that cash, may run out, often does run out when you see companies end up in bankruptcy, and then they're stuck with a monthly rent payment that they can't cover. So that only gets them so far. Companies that are borrowing in the market or issuing new stock, and unless you're looking at like a biotech type company that is in a pure development cash burn startup type situation, raising capital in the markets or borrowing money to fund operating cash burn will only get you so far. Companies that fail to invest in maintenance and CapEx. This is an interesting one because it ultimately leads to sort of a generalized decay of the business that in turn drives the 3 factors Patrick's going to talk about.
Yeah, the declining, product quality and customer dissatisfaction. You can see this coming. There's a lot of reasons that lead to that. You mentioned the CapEx, for example, but in the receivable side, we see this. You see receivables increasing, people not paying on time. It's slow, but how do you find it earlier? And the number one thing we find out is that if we're looking to keep an eye on reviews, investigate the social media, customers are the first people to know if there's a problem with the product, and they're the first ones to tell everybody about it. To keep an eye on that really helps us. but to go to the next piece here, the increasing in returns in product. A lot of this is it's a short-term product. It could be a small manufacturing problem. It could be a delivery problem. Maybe a problem with some of the warranties that are taking place with this. A design change in the product. Again, back to CapEx, doing something to cut corners. But the piece that you miss in this is a customer service. If there's a problem with the product, you've got great customer service people in there. You're ready to handle it. You're ready to deal with it, to keep that customer happy. And ultimately, you might find out that that's where the problem lies. As you look at this shrinking market share because of the competition, that's pretty straightforward. I mean, obviously, someone can have a better product. If they're offering better terms, better customer service. But, part of this is just client preference. They get a feel that something's not right with the company and they're willing to go to another business. They might be offering better credit terms that allow them to do it. Even a slight change in price, but it comes down to really a loss of customer loyalty. And that's clearly a warning sign. So the operational concerns, you're getting right down into it. Roll up your sleeves and find out what's happening at this company. Costly, troubled launches of the new product. Every time I read this, I keep thinking about Tesla, and they came out with the Cybertruck, and Elon Musk takes a brick and he hits the window to show that it won't shatter, and of course it shatters, right? It's one of the great things about this, that early on you see a delay in the launch of that product, but it changes the market, right? People really demand a great product, especially when it first comes off the line. Increased costs then will cause a delay in this. Anytime there's a delay in that product, it'll just have huge negative impact to that customer base. Well, why? Quality and delivery issues. You might have a small operational hiccup that takes place, right? When that happens, you'll see this really slow down in delivery issues. Unreliable delivery times. You can't count on it to be there. It leads to this negative reviews. It leads to permanent brand damage with some of these delivery issues. And part of that is the market conditions change. Dramatically increased cost. Back to supply chain disruptions. Labor costs. Tariffs, we've mentioned all these. But the reduced demand for their product or service could be something simple. A shift in the economy, likely a new tech innovation from a competitor. But these concerns are clear warning signs of, frankly, a bigger problem. So that competition, when you look at bringing in someone into the industry that may be a little bit of a disruptor, right? A great business model. And in order to keep up with this disruptor in their business, it really affects their margins. Strength of profit margins, trying to keep up with the latest, greatest from competition. The next one really caught my attention, loss of key employees. We see this a lot if we do our audits and our evaluation of these troubled businesses. Clearly, you're talking about replacement time and losing a key employee, right? Loss of history, loss of knowledge. The hidden reason that you might not even get your arms around there is lower company morale. You lose a few key employees and you may not see it on the balance sheet, but it can have some huge impact. So this is why this is one of these areas of concern. And losing the right people or the wrong people might, delay growth plans. It might even slow down or delay a new product launch with that key employee. You take it a step further and you see the loss of a customer, key customer. We've all seen this. It puts immediate pressure on the cash flow of the organization. It's a huge problem. Maybe scaling back operations, changing the margins, number one, but also their ability to keep up with the other companies that they're servicing. Loss of key suppliers is an important one. When I read this, you're talking about a key supplier, talking about, production time. You're not going to be able to produce the product you were producing previously when you lose a key supplier. Massive strain on customer satisfaction. and we'll continue on with that topic later.
So we've looked at the entire funnel directly down to the customer of all the way from the macroeconomy down through industries and down to the customer. Now we're going to look outside of the customer. We're going to look at what the outside world is saying about this customer and or this borrower rather, and what they think about the borrower. And there's a number of sources, whether they're paid information sources, or whether they're publicly available information, or whether they're market data that indicate what the credit quality of this particular borrower may be. There's a robust market in the trade universe of things like credit insurance and accounts receivable puts. So protection for the lowest layer of the capital structure totem pole before you get to equity. When you see those types of coverage go away for a particular borrower, and these are typically folks that have lots and lots of information that may or may not be available to you in your capacity as a lender, that can be an indication, hey, somebody sees stress or distress in this customer, this borrower, this company. If a company has rated debt, whether it's your debt, whether it's bonds they have out in the public market, something that's subject to rating by a ratings agency, you see a credit downgrade to a tier below investment grade. Again, usually a pretty significant warning sign that one of the ratings agencies has seen some problems, has seen some cracks, has seen some of the pressures we've really talked about on the previous slides. The upside of that is you'll usually get a nice report with that explains exactly why and exactly what they're forecasting. If a company has broadly syndicated debt, if they have, whether they have a loan facility that is broadly syndicated, or they have bonds that are publicly traded, the trading prices of those are readily available. You can get them on the Bloomberg terminal. You can get them from other sources like Market for loans. Those can be a very useful proxy for what various layers of the capital structure and various folks with rights and claims against different elements of the company's overall organizational structure are likely to recover. If you see other secured debt that is trading under par, for reasons other than an interest rate disparity, right? You've got somebody that's got debt that's below market, an interest rate on debt that's below market, that's probably going to trade below par to the extent of the difference in interest rate. But if you see secured debt, or also if you see unsecured debt trading at a meaningful yield to maturity, a double-digit yield to maturity, fairly significant sign of distress. If you see institutional holders or other insiders of a company selling off significant blocks of stock in a publicly traded borrower, right? You've got folks that have more information than anybody in the world. Obviously, they're subject to disclosure requirements when they do sell. You see those folks starting to sell, significant canary in the coal mine. Other things, and some of these are news items, and some of these are regulatory filings. So if you're dealing with a borrower that is a publicly traded reporting company, they file an NT10Q saying, greetings world, greetings SEC. We know we're an accelerated filer. We're not going to be able to file our 10Q this quarter on time. Either we're going to file it like a normal filer, or we're going to file it even later than that. Usually there's a reason for that behind the scenes. And the two most common reasons we see for that behind the scenes, especially with a 10K, are number one, there's a restatement of prior periods that's under discussion internally because some accounting irregularity has been identified. Or two, I think this is more frequent in the distressed universe, the borrower is in a position where their auditor on a 10K is not going to give them an unqualified, clean audit opinion. And so they're in discussions with the auditor about how to get to that point, or you're also seeing them behind the scenes potentially changing the auditor, shopping around for somebody who will give them an unqualified opinion. And obviously on a public company or on a non-public company where you get audited financials, if you see audited financials that contain a going concern qualification from the auditor, huge red flag, huge warning sign that, hey, there's a problem afoot, right? The company's auditor is not willing to say, hey, read these financial statements from the standpoint that this company's going to be around for a while. They can't give you that assurance. That's a problem. You see the CEO, CFO, or other key officers resign without a known and publicly disclosed transition policy in place, right? Sometimes this happens for health reasons, and that's understandable. But if you see a company that's in a bit of turmoil and you see key management leave, sometimes there's a reason for that, and you should look at it. If you see a company retain restructuring counsel or restructuring advisors, this used to happen behind the scenes. It wasn't really reported on. There's now a cottage industry that Mike's going to talk about in a little bit, of data sources that gather this information from rumors, that gather this information, sort of through the grapevine, and report on it. So you may get a report, hey, such and such a company has retained, the following law firm and the following investment banker to help them explore strategic alternatives. Well, there's certain folks in that space that when they get involved, it's usually to prep for a bankruptcy. At the same time, if you see board members leave, or, whether or not in conjunction with board members leaving, you see a company appoint new independent directors with insolvency backgrounds or restructuring backgrounds, that is a blinking, flashing red light that, hey, this company may be preparing for a bankruptcy.
So we could look again upstream, the supplier risks. This is really an important piece for these businesses, and it's a great way to see trouble that's really coming down the road in the very near future. So the risk of suppliers seeking cancellation, suspension, or even delayed deliveries on purchase orders or contracts. Looking for small product problems here, right? But we see that some of these suppliers may even be attempting to renegotiate the terms or change what they are with those companies. And it really makes us stop and wonder what the real issue is here. The risk of slowing down production, delayed deliveries, key goods and services, really make it harder and impossible to fulfill the projects, complete the orders, meet the targets that you have from an upstream supplier. So what's funny here, it's difficulty in even obtaining a new supplier. You're halfway through the year, something comes up, you're facing a lot of issues. They're facing increased costs, definite change in delivery times, slowing down the manufacturing or the services, whatever it is. Most importantly, I always think about the credit terms. You drag in a new supplier, likely not going to get the same terms you had previously. So when this happens, a lot of these businesses, they run into a situation with their current supplier that they've hit their credit limits. I consider this the kiss of death when you get this, that you're probably at the end, right? Once your supplier cuts you off, production's on hold, delays and missed deadlines, things like this. And when we see that happen, we know that there's a serious problem taking place. So they're left with some solutions of finding another supplier. In that, you're facing higher costs, but they've got to find a supplier that's reliable, one that's consistent, that carries all the requested, products that they're going to need. They're definitely going to not get the same prices. They're definitely not going to get the same credit terms. So when you see this happen, obviously there's adverse impact cash flow results, right? But the key that's listed here is it's inefficient. When this happens, typically involves a transition, right? They're going to have to go through this new system, get used to working together. Same issues, delivery times, higher pricing, and clearly lower credit lines. So let's talk about the sources of information. I'll let you dive into this about distressed borrowers. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the sources of information. So we talked about the warning signs, but warning signs in many regards are only as good as the sources you're able to get them from. So let's talk about that. And it's funny, we're here supposed to be presenting to you and telling you, right, where to find sources and what the sources are. And yet the very first one that's going to be on this slide that you see here is you. We're just punting it right back to you. And you're going to hear us say this a couple of different times in a couple of different ways, but it's the truth. At the end of the day, professionals like those of us giving this presentation, we're certainly a source. We have sources that we can access at our fingertips, and I'm sure you have other external sources at your fingertips, but at the end of the day, you're the first line of defense when it comes to understanding your borrower, understanding the risks associated with your borrower, seeing financial distress on the horizon. You're the boots on the ground. And so ultimately, knowing your borrower, reviewing your loan file, staying on top of your distressed borrowers, right? Staying close to them, keeping communications internally with your respective teams, your loan officers, your sales force, whatever the case might be, making sure, right, you have your branches out internally and directly to your borrowers where necessary, so that you have a flow of information to you and you understand, right, when circumstances might be turning towards one of those warning signs that were discussed before, on a micro level, when you zoom in from the 30,000-foot view that Andrew was describing before. Another extension of, this is the next few bullets on this slide, right? They're external, but the first one is essentially an extension of you, right? Maybe not you specifically, but the other yous on this, listening to this webinar, right? Other lenders, lender groups, right? Whether part of a syndicated loan where you have other lenders involved in your loan, or whether in connection with an industry credit group, credit reporting network, right? The word of other lenders, right, that are in the same industry as you, in the same space as you, can potentially be a clue into the potential warning signs that were discussed before. And then beyond that, then you can start.
Do you mind? Do you mind if I
Yeah,
jump in here for one? Yeah, let me just jump in.
absolutely.
When you talk about the first bullet point there is know your borrower, it's really important because you've got to look at things like some industry trends, right? So what's happening in that industry? Seasonality. We talked about personnel changes with your borrower. These are really detailed things, but pretty easy to get your arms around if you'd like to take a look at it. Review your loan file, make sure it's there. Check your UCCs, right? Check addresses, location, look at the audits. Know your collateral, know the business. But the other piece that he mentioned there, I agree, is stay close to your distressed borrowers. Regular meetings, listen carefully. A lot of times you're going to let out some information if you're listening carefully what they're saying. We do these audits and you go in and talk to the businesses directly, and you get someone alone in the office and they kind of look around and say, hey, what's the real problem? What are you running into? And they kind of will look around and see if anybody's listening. They'll say, well, actually, here's what's happening, right? They're willing to share some of the problems with you that may not be public, but going through on a individual basis, you might get a lot of information from them. Your sales force, they know what's happening. They can smell market changes and things like that are happening. And for lenders, the loan officers, they get their sleeves rolled up. They're going through the financials. They'll clearly have some insight. And just the last thing I'll touch on here is other lenders. You're right. It's a great community, regional, banking associations, the CFA, American Bankers Associations, all those groups. And for people outside the banking industry, whatever industry groups you have, there's a lot of chatter in there. You have to slow down and listen to it. And this is something you get your arms around pretty quickly. All right, I'll let you keep going.
No, absolutely. And some other external sources where now we can pivot away a little bit from the you theme. All listed here on this slide, and some of them are probably intuitive, but industry reports, analyst reports, and even simple social media and web searches, right? News alerts, but social media and web searches. Sometimes social media is the first place where news starts cracking, and sometimes the fact that the news is cracking on social media ends up making it more true than it might have been to begin with. And so all of these external sources are at your fingertips as well. And I guess before we move on to the next slide, where we'll start to dive into how Cadex and then in following that Lowenstein have sources at our fingertips that can help you, just we'll go in from there. So I'll turn it over to the Cadex team to discuss how they can help.
Yeah, and to piggyback kind of on what Michael said, we've spent most of the time covering the warning signs, but the main question is, what do you do once you find the warning signs, right? What do you do next? And we're just here to say, hey, give us a call. We have a ton of experience and resources. Just going through some of these bullets, receivables database. You guys may know it says receivables control. We're now Cadex, but we have 55 years of history. We have 55 years of data. We collect over we manage over $1.7 billion in receivables monthly. We've collected from millions of customers over the years. So if you see a troubled borrower, it's likely that we've dealt with them before. So this can help give us a nice roadmap to help speed up the process. Industry experts. We've also handled over 1,000 liquidations in our 55 years history. So, like I said, it's very likely that we've seen something similar to what you're dealing with. So feel free to give us a call. Collateral review. This is a big one. A lot of what Patrick does is working with lenders, and he does audits or collateral reviews specific to receivables or the AR portfolio. So we tell banks we'll be on site in 24 hours. If you're seeing problems with the receivables, we'll go there. And we know banks have their own auditors, but we look at it from a liquidation lens, right? It's easy to project what the receivables are worth if the company's healthy, but the game changes once they start going into a wind down mode. So we'll dig in deep. We'll look through their documentation. We'll look what's the warranty look like, what's the return policy. So we'll give you a breakdown. We'll go through a 20-page report. We'll look at who are the key staff members that we need to keep around if it has the liquidation. And then at the end of the day, we'll come back to you and say, hey, if the company were to survive, here's what the receivables are worth. And then plan B, if they have to liquidate, here's what the AR would be worth. So we give you kind of both options and a breakdown of what that looks like. Review changes. This is more of our research and investigation department. We have access to several pieces of technology as far as LexisNexis, bankruptcy data, but we can pull all of the tax liens against the company, a deep dive on their financial history, UCC filings, lawsuits, judgments. Obviously, those are huge warning signs to look out for. And then another key is rapid response. Like I said, we'll be on site within 24 hours because we know a lot of times it's a race to the money. If they owe you money, it's very likely that they owe other people money. So we want to make sure we get you to the top of the list. But then lastly, detailed analysis. We want to make sure we provide detailed recovery updates and cash forecasts so you can make sure we report that up the chain, and not only show how much we're going to recover, but a monthly breakdown of when that cash will come in, so you guys can predict that for your cash flow purposes.
And as for Lowenstein, it says here right on this slide, but I'll still say it, even though I'm not reading it off the slide. I promise. We live in this space, and that gives us access to a lot of information in a couple of different ways. One, our firm contacts, our credit contacts, right? We know folks who are boots on the ground dealing in various different industries, right? That gives us a sense of what areas are in distress, what particular entities might be in distress. Some of that ends up being confidential, but as a general matter, right, we're on the ground, right? Be operating in the space, operating in the industry. It gives us a certain level of expertise and knowledge with respect to, possible warning signs and whatnot on the horizon. And I'm not going to rehash all those warning signs that were discussed earlier in the presentation. But also being fully ingrained in this space where, right, distress, insolvency, bankruptcy at the end of the day, right, are what we do. That means we invest heavily in tools that gives us access to warning signs. Andrew touched upon a really big one. Octus, DebtWire, right? These are publications that send regular reporting on some of those whispers that Andrew was alluding to within certain industries, within certain circles. Andrew gave it in the specific context of we'll know from these outlets when restructuring professionals are hired, when other key news around a company that might be heading towards a distress scenario or in a distress scenario. These entities are specifically right out there to report on these circumstances, and we'll get those real-time updates from them because we've subscribed to them. And while certain entities out there, because they're not fully ingrained in the distress space, it might not be an investment they've made to get these updates, but it's an investment that we have made. And on a regular basis, if you were to look at our inboxes over here at Lowenstein, you would see a flurry of these updates across various industries reporting on various entities at all ends of the spectrum of that warning sign horizon. Some other outlets, right? Bloomberg Market, access to being able to see bond and loan pricing. Also some news reporting as well as from those entities, but the bond and loan pricing information is really helpful. We say it all the time when we have access to seeing what debt might be traded at or selling at, and we see that, say secured debt is trading at, say, 80 cents on the dollar, right? That's certainly not a great indication for that entity's debt and ability to pay that debt. And we're able to access that information with respect to various companies through these entities. And there's also a variety of other sources that we subscribe to that's laid out here on this slide that whether Wall Street Pro, Distressed Company Alert, The Deal, you name it, that again, it gives us access to information where we're seeking it and where we're looking. Like I said, though, our inboxes are flooded with this information. We get access to all of these reporting entities that send us news into our inbox on variety of entities. We stay generally in the loop with respect to as much of it as we can. But at the end of the day, I'm going to punt it right back. You, boots on the ground, for us to actually then specifically target an entity, sometimes the way we know to do that is from hearing from the folks who are actually directly impacted, right? It's their borrower and they want to know more. And then that clues us in to then utilize those tools that are at our disposal to really drill in on, okay, what information is out there with respect to that entity. And so at the end of the day, in a lot of ways, pivoting it right back to you, the audience, in a lot of ways, the onus can be on you, right? Let us know, reach out, and that enables us to give you access to all the things that we're capable of doing, both Lowenstein and Cadex, of course. And with that, we're a minute over time, so I'll hold off on giving any closing soliloquy. If anyone else wants to, they're welcome to do so.
Pardon me, I'll add one final note here that part 2 of this will be coming. This is a real hands-on review where this information comes to life. And so part 2 on May 13th, 2 p.m. So we're a little verbose, so we had to cut this into 2 pieces. But the important part will be coming up and seeing how to apply this and using specific examples.
In a world where the path from order to cash is fraught with complicated issues and interactions, someone had to make it easier to manage every processed payment and exchange. Bringing together the most trusted names in AR management and collections, Cadex was built to clear your path to cash. We simplify the complexity of order to cash so you can move faster, perform better, and get paid sooner. Our solutions help you manage, recover, and retain revenue while elevating the customer experience along the way. Because in a global marketplace, better experiences drive better business outcomes. From order entry and invoicing to cash application and collections, we bring the right combination of people, process, and technology to reduce aging and accelerate your time to cash. And with over 2,000 clients served, we know past due isn't the problem, it's a symptom. That's why we start upstream with a customer-first mindset to prevent AR backlogs before they happen, because delays, disputes, and breakdowns don't happen overnight. They build over time through disconnected systems, stalled invoices, language gaps, and portal issues. You've seen them, so have we, and we've solved them at scale. We use your data to catch problems early, and we deploy intelligent workflows, automation, and self-service tools tailored to your business, so issues get fixed before they become fire drills. And after 100 years helping the world's largest enterprises recover receivables and collect what they're owed without compromising what they've built, we know just how challenging that can be. Which is why, under Cadex, we're helping enterprises transform how they manage order to cash with better reach, better guidance, and better tools. Cadex, built to get difficult done.